Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to A Gathering Place brought to you by the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce. And my name is Marilyn Hemingway, and I'm your host today for A Gathering Place. And today we welcome Damon Fordham, historian, author, and we're going to be talking about his most recent book, the 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina. This is a topic and book that I have been anxiously waiting for to discuss with Damon Fordham, and I am looking forward to the day. And I want to remind you, just drop your questions and comments in the comment section, and we'll get to as many as we can right after this opening. Hello, I'm Marilyn Hemingway, and welcome to A Gathering Place. I said I'm stepping back because we have young voices who want to be heard, and they're moving on something.
Branding is really important to you and your business.
Even a basic type of technology, you learn it all.
And people are
Good question. Well, we're back, folks, and we're talking about the 1895 segregation fight in South Carolina. And one thing I want to say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And there's the root, if you understand history, it's the root of a lot of what we're seeing now in the present. And with that said, let's welcome our special guest, Damon Fordham, historian, author. Damon, it is always good to have you.
Same here, Marilyn. It's great to be here.
All right. Thank you. So the 1895 segregation fight in South Carolina. Some historical names are tied to this. One, not the least, is Ben Pitchfork Tillman. But you're going to talk about some known and unknown Black historical figures that basically kind of went to battle with Ben Pitchfork Tillman, stood up to him, and they were heroes. And unfortunately, we don't hear a lot about them, but you're here to tell us, to educate us. And I want to start with, as you start, Damon, with your book, with the introduction, you get into Reconstruction. And I made a note to myself because Reconstruction, I remember in school learning Reconstruction was about carpetbaggers and scalawags, and it was just full of corrupted people stealing the money. And the illustrations in the books were usually like the fat men just kind of throwing money around and
Ignorant, stealing.
ignorant, and black and whites, but then the blacks usually have big lips and ignorant looking.
Minstrel show stuff.
Yeah, so I was delighted that you opened the book. The introduction kind of laid the groundwork and addressed that, and what I have learned so much, the Reconstruction era now, the federal government is doing more to bring attention to Reconstruction. There's actually a Reconstruction era center in Beaufort, Georgetown, where I live. Huge leadership in Reconstruction. With Joseph Hayne Rainey, James Bowley, and one that you're going to talk about, he comes a little bit after, but Robert Anderson, who's part of this. Of course, Robert Smalls from Beaufort, but there were others. And I really want to get into that. Let's start with Reconstruction and how that what we were taught is not really what happened. And we really overall need to have a more accurate picture of our history, because when you have a more accurate picture of our history, you really do start to understand the strength and intellect of the leadership. In particular, I'm talking about Black leadership at that time. We did not go into Reconstruction by happenstance. Black people fought for their emancipation. They were active participants, and because they were active participants, they were preparing for emancipation. what we call Reconstruction. And that speaks to intellect, that speaks to strength. And that's something we don't really get that conversation. And I say that because it led to the segregation fight. These people just didn't come out of nowhere. There's threads in everything. There's foundational things that led to this segregation fight. So I'm glad your introduction, if you could just talk about that a little bit, and then we'll go deeper into the book itself.
Certainly. Now, what you're referring to is the little note, because see, people think that are under the impression, because see, the average person knows what they are told. It's a relative few of us who go deep into the libraries and the archives and dig up these things. And usually when they do, they're done by academics who put these things in scholarly journals that are not read by the average person. And it's one of my goals since you and I were taught by giants like Dean Willie Harford at the University of South Carolina, is to make these things accessible to the average Jane and the average Joe in language that they understand, because they're the ones who need this stuff. I'm really not interested in other academics and all of that, just sitting around with them, sharing it with them. I want the general public to know this. Now, as to the preparation of Reconstruction, it was not a case that Lincoln waved his magic wand and said, "You're free." That came through a lot of effort on a number of levels. When the Civil War started, Lincoln himself was against slavery, but he was cautious of losing the bigoted Northern vote, so he went slow on that issue. It was people like Robert Smalls here in Charleston, who in 1892, he was from Beaufort, 1862. He sneaked his family aboard a Confederate ship called the Planter, and he emancipated himself and his family that way by sailing the boat into Union waters and turning it over to the Union Navy. And in North Carolina, you had an African American named Abraham Galloway, who never learned to read or write, who was also sneaking out of North Carolina, and he met with Lincoln to encourage him to allow African Americans to vote. And Frederick Douglass encouraged Lincoln to use Black people in the Union Army, as well as negotiating emancipation. So while all this is happening, the Northern Army took over the Sea Islands around Beaufort, all of Port Royal and all that, and they gave the Black people there a chance of self-government, known as the Port Royal Experiment. And that was it sounds bizarre today, but this was to see if Black people could be left alone to run their own affairs. And that experiment proved successful. You had the Penn Center, one of the first schools immediately right before emancipation, you see. So with all this happening, this convinced Lincoln to go all out. And by the time, right until 3 days before he was assassinated, April 11th, 1865, he said that he would see the day that the Black people the Black men who fought for the Union would have the right to vote, and they would establish public schools in the South. Well, he gets killed. Andrew Johnson takes over and tries to rescind all of that. And before Lincoln was killed, they had the whole 40 acres and a mule plan for the newly freed Black soldiers from Charleston to Jacksonville. But Andrew Jackson killed all that, and you had the Black codes and all these other things. So there had to be a second revolution in Congress to where they said, this South is going back to the Confederacy. We're not having this. And because of the advancements of these Black people, that led them to what's known as radical Reconstruction, where they gave Black people the right to vote, and Black people chose their own representatives in numerous states, including ours. A Black governor in Louisiana named Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who was the founder of Southern University. 2 Black lieutenant governors in South Carolina, Alonzo Jacob Rancier and William Howell Gleaves. And Robert Smalls, while he was in the Reconstruction legislature, he was the one who started the idea of the public school system in South Carolina. William J. Whipper of Beaufort, he wanted women to have the right to vote, but they said that was too radical at the time. But they allowed women to divorce abusive husbands. Now, how this was traditionally taught in the South Carolina history books by Mary Sims Oliphant that was used from 1917 to 1984 said this: more than half of the members of the legislature were Negroes, and most of these could neither read nor write. They spent nearly all of their time in the legislature and stealing the money of the people. Thousands and thousands of dollars were taken by these Black thieves. Neither the property or the lives of the white people were safe anywhere in the state. It must be realized that the state had a tremendous problem to face in the sudden liberation of irresponsible, uneducated, immoral, and brutish Africans. And this is what children were taught for generations, because the Daughters of the Confederacy under Mildred Rutherford in Georgia, they basically laid out the Southern policy for these textbooks to have pro-Confederate propaganda. And part of that was to ensure that Black people would remain a permanent class of cheap labor in the South. Because you see, as Frederick Douglass understood, you cannot make a man who knows how to read and write, a man who is educated cannot be made a slave. You see, you can't enslave a person like that. So this was done along with to justify segregation so that Black people could remain a permanent class of cheap labor in the South.
And I want you to you mentioned the Black codes. And let's go back to that for a second, because part of the Black codes was to make it illegal for Black people to learn how to read and write, and made it illegal for other people to teach them how to read and write. And that was just part of the Black code.
Well, during slavery, yes.
Yeah.
But after emancipation, they were not allowed to have guns and hold meetings and have certain types of jobs. You see, it was a sort of semi-slavery that the Northern legislatures saw all this happening, and the Black leaders of that time, like Frederick Douglass, said, hold up, we're not having all of that. And this is what led them to impeach Andrew Johnson and sort of start all over again by allowing Black people in the South to vote, where they picked their leaders among the educated of their people. And this is when these things started to change. They got together with the former white abolitionists, you see, to make the new policy here. And the Confederates for a time were disfranchised for treason against the United States. And side note to that, the 14th Amendment, part of the 14th Amendment, Article 3, says that you can be removed from office for treason against the United States. And they're using that right now. Some are trying to use that right now against a certain former president of ours. Now
and those who did the January 6th insurrection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or Fort Sumter Part 2, as I call that.
Yeah. that needs to be another book in and of itself. But as you were speaking and I was listening to these things that Blacks were prevented from doing, and how much it's reflective of some of what's happening today, what we just talked about, the 14th Amendment being used regarding a former president, the insurrectionists, but also the limitations that are being discussed in state governments, in particular regarding women, but it's going to impact all of us. Crossing state lines if they suspect that you may have had an abortion, or helping someone to have an abortion. But that's further down the road. Let's stay with our conversation here with the 1895 segregation fight in South Carolina. So this is all leading to a particular person who runs on a gubernatorial ticket, and he's kind of blatant about why he's running. He wants to disenfranchise Black folks. And before I knew some of what you've written about in the book, I knew about Benjamin Pitchfork Tillman because of the massacre in Hamburg, South Carolina.
Yes, North Augusta.
He was known as being a very violent man, and bragging about it too. Bragging about, he didn't hide who he was, but he was kind of like this manifestation, this one person that took all of this anger from the Confederacy and took it, and he ran for office and he won, and it led to other consequences. But that's the KKK was formed during Reconstruction, has pushed back to these Black men who were elected into these offices, and as you noted, Robert Smalls in particular, introducing public school education. And it wasn't just for recently emancipated Black folks, it was for poor white folks also. And that's what people don't understand, is when Black people advance, everyone advances. Let's bring it up nearer to recent voting rights. When we got the Voting Rights Act in 1965, it didn't just enfranchise Black people, into particular Black women, but poor whites who were left out of voting also. And I want to make that point as you go into your book, that this battle, all too often, I think, we define these historical movements, the civil rights movement, as a Black person's thing. It is, but it's always been bigger than that. It's been about demanding that this country live up to what is written on paper, that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and happiness, equality and equity. And Reconstruction, I think more and more people are realizing it was one of those brief moments of time in our history where we really were striving for the ideals that were written in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence. But there's always historically been pushback in America from folks who, you said it, the Dodgers of the Confederacy. They always wanted that underclass of labor, cheap labor, to create the wealth of this country. And I think Tillman was a violent reaction to this. So your book, why this book, why this time, and what should we get out of this book?
Okay, a lot to answer with that.
Well, we got
Number
an
one,
hour.
okay. Number one, the subject of Benjamin Tillman.
Yes.
Benjamin Tillman was from Trenton, South Carolina, in Edgefield County. And since he was born in 1847, he was too young to have served with the Confederate Army. But he was a member of the Red Shirts, which was basically the Klan group of South Carolina. Now, the Klan itself, it started in Pulaski, Tennessee in December 24th, 1865, with 6 Confederate veterans. And they used the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan, to name their new organization. And they thought it would be cute to, kind of cute to sort of, make this little play on words with that. So the problem was this. You had these poor, as I said before, most people know what they've been taught. And one of the main things that kept racism going, as well as American slavery, was the idea that they went to the poor whites who had nothing else going for them, and they encouraged them to believe that they were superior to the blacks as a means of divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. The poor whites were being used as pawns. Bob Dylan, in fact, made that point explicit in a song called "Only a Pawn in Their Game" when down in Mississippi, Medgar Evers was killed by Byron Beckwith, right? So anyway, so that led them to act against their own best interests for the psychological need of having someone below them on the totem pole, so to speak. And this is why they tended to support things like this, because the idea that was given to them was that if black people advanced, the poor whites would be at the bottom of society, and they didn't want to see that happen. So as long as the poor whites kept thinking like that and acting like that, the Southern aristocracy could stay where it was. And see, that's the thing that you have to understand about all this. It wasn't just the whole idea of quote unquote white supremacy. It was really rich white supremacy on the back of the poor whites that all of this stuff came about. Now, back to as to why this book and all that, right? Well, several things. Back in 1998, I read a book called "Lift Every Voice," a compilation of Black speeches. Yes, I read things like that. And I came across this speech by Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State, where he was telling the South Carolina legislature that they were 8 years in power and all the great things they did in Reconstruction, and how he was rebutting Benjamin Ryan Tillman, who was trying to segregate the state. And I said, whoa, I never heard about this, because you learn something new every day when you do research. So I said, wow, let me get into this. So I would go to the Caroliniana Library's archives, and I found a pamphlet in the book. I said that he's his wife, but it's actually his daughter, Mary J. Miller, who compiled some of her father's speeches at this. And I said, wow, it was that. And then Robert Small's daughter, Sarah J. Smalls, compiled her father's speeches at that convention. And then I went through the old issues of the Columbia State newspaper that covered this convention where these 6 black men actually came and stood up to Benjamin Tillman, who was trying to segregate the state. And I said, this is a story that needs to be told. Mm-hmm. And the irony of it is that when I was in the archive room looking through all this stuff, guess what was looking above me? A bust of Benjamin Tillman.
Wow.
And so I looked up at that statue and I smiled and said, yeah, I'm going to fix you all right. So in a sense, that statue kind of inspired me to get the story out there. So a 1-chapter version of this story existed in my book, Voices of Black South Carolina. And several years later, I got a call from a certain publisher who wanted to know if I had anything new in mind. And I threw him several things. And I said, hey, wait, there's the story that I want to expand from one of my earlier books. Well, that publisher was an academic press who rejected it. And I said, I don't care about writing for academics anyway. I want to write for the people. So I contacted the History Arcadia Press, who I'd done 2 of my books under. And they said, that's a great idea. Now get this. The other publisher rejected that book in December. And I got with the History Press the very next day. And they said, yeah, we can work with this. And the book itself was in the can before I left for Africa in May. And it came out and the book itself came out on this July 25th. So it worked out beautifully. And the thing was that, right. And so the thing is that I figured that if I was of a man like myself, who is pretty well versed in history and teaches for a living, was inspired by this, imagine how other people would be inspired by a story of this kind. And not just black people, because there are a couple of white people in the book who play a really significant role on the good side in the story too. One of them, as a matter of fact, is one of your homeboys from Georgetown, John Harleston Reed, who was a representative of that convention. He and another white representative named T.E. Dudley out of Marlborough County, South Carolina. Those 2 whites were the only ones who voted with the black delegates to go against Benjamin Tillman in the segregation constitution.
So you mentioned that Harleston name to me before, and I actually do know some Harlestons who are probably related to that gentleman. That's a prominent Georgetown name. Yeah.
Well, see, again, this goes to show you how deep so many of these things were buried. Now, I should say this to add context to that. The whole thing, part of the thing with the 1895 Constitution is this. In 1868, in Charleston, at what's now known as the J. Waties Waring Judicial Center over on Meeting Street, between January and April 1868, 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered at that building to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina into one that promised equality for all. And that was where Robert Smalls made the proposal for the public school system. That's when they made anti-discrimination laws. They called for state hospitals and mental institutions. They called an end to debtors' prisons in South Carolina, among many other things. And that also led to the fact that the University of South Carolina from 1873 to 1877 was the first and only desegregated school in this part below the Mason-Dixon line. But so Tillman and all of them, because in fact, when Tillman in 1895, and I have in the book where a black reporter is trying to tell Ben Tillman, listen, this gave you the best constitution your state ever had. Why do you want to get rid of this? And so Tillman sidestepped that issue and went on about how, quote, the Negroes were too ignorant to vote and so forth. This was what Tillman and his followers wanted to believe. In the same way, recently I had a discussion with my students about this at the Citadel, how a lot of people they knew really had the psychological need to believe that Barack Obama was a terrible president because the idea of having a black president while they weren't doing a whole lot with their lives was just too bitter a pill to swallow. So Tillman filled into that psychological need to gather the white vote in South Carolina.
It's fascinating to me, the psychological manipulation that was done in leading into the 1895 Constitution, the Constitutional Convention. And as you noted with Barack Obama, you still see it in 2022, the manipulation. And you're right, this listening to this Constitution that was passed to give us public school education, to give us mental health, hospitals, to end discrimination. And we're still fighting in 2022 for these very same things. And even at that time, there's a gentleman in the book that you noted who noted that I'm speaking in my terms, but he kind of anticipated this pushback. That
Francis Cardozo.
If it wasn't codified in law, that this pushback was going to end all that they put into place. And sure enough, over time, that 1895 Constitution, but Jim Crow laws, just the pushback that we're experiencing even now in 2022, it's like history repeating itself. But let's talk about 1895, because there was a constitutional convention that leads to the Constitution. How did this come about? And how did these Black gentlemen, these Black elected officials, decide that they were going to push back?
Okay, the essence of that was this. In 1877, you had the Tilden-Hayes Compromise that ended Reconstruction, which meant that the federal troops would leave the South, and they basically told the South, hey, you're on your own. So Wade Hampton was the governor, and he promised that Black people would not have their rights taken away and so forth. But then he went on to the Senate in Washington, D.C., and this was followed by governors who were inflamed easily by the red shirts and people like that, who were violently against the Black vote. And so thus there began to be this whittling away over a period of time of Black people's right to vote, so much so that in 1892, for example, they were passing ridiculous things like this to restrict Black voting. They had this business where, get this, a separate list of all Negro voters must be kept and returned with the poll list. Every Negro applying to vote must produce a written statement by 10 white men who shall swear that they know of their own knowledge that such voters voted for Governor Wade Hampton in 1876 and have voted the Democratic ticket continuously ever since. The statement must be placed in the ballot box by managers. Now, there's something to explain about the language of that, is that the 15th Amendment in 1870 said that you cannot deny a person the right to vote because of race, color, or previous servitude, right? So basically they said, yes, we will let Black people vote. So they would throw in these stipulations like that, the ridiculous ones, to reduce and to eliminate the Black vote. So in 1894, Tillman was the senator by then, and this is a year after he helped a Black man named John Peterson get lynched in Denmark, South Carolina, which is another story. But his whole plan was that he noticed that the white Democratic Party in South Carolina was split between these people, between the ones who followed him and the ones called the conservatives, who were more conciliatory. So to stop that nearly losing the Senate, he would eliminate the Black vote in South Carolina to solidify and unify the white vote, to keep people like himself in power. It was a power play. But the Black people of South Carolina said, oh, no. And they had a convention in 1895 in Columbia where they picked these 6 brave leaders: Robert Smalls of Beaufort, William J. Whipper of Charleston, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 Black lawyers from Beaufort, Thomas Miller, the founder of South Carolina State University, the founding president of South Carolina State University, and Robert Anderson of Georgetown. And incidentally, so these men were elected to basically represent the Black people during this convention in Columbia. And by the way, one of the first things they did was that Robert Anderson brought the suggestion for the creation of South Carolina State University.
Congratulations, Robert Anderson. So this is also the root of South Carolina State University, right, now. All right.
Yes, it would. Tillman agreed to that as sort of a saying, "Oh well, at least I'll let you have something."
That was going to be my question. Was that like
Right?
to
So Thomas
pacify
Miller,
the questioning, the pushback?
right? So that was the conciliatory note given to the Black community of South Carolina that they would at least get South Carolina State out of the deal, with the understanding that no teachers would be white and no teachers would be from the North. It was to be a strictly industrial type school.
I was
And
going
so,
to say, is that why it was also agriculture industrial? Because
right,
basically, they were creating workers for the fields, is what they were thinking.
exactly. So Thomas Miller basically went into being the founding president of that, but he was kicked out in 1911 when Coleman Blease, the lynching governor, who is even worse than Ben Tillman, who even Ben Tillman looked down upon, became governor. Thomas Miller openly spoke out against him and was fired from his position at South Carolina State. And he died in Charleston in 1938. But there's an interesting story of redemption for him near the very end of the book that we'll deal with a little bit later.
Okay.
And the irony of that was that, now you mentioned the issue of industrial education. Most progressive historians, basically make Booker T. Washington to be the bad guy in all of this. But it was Booker T. Washington who spoke most vociferously against Tillman during this period. It's something that a lot of people don't know, is that Booker T. Washington, the founding president, I should say, of Tuskegee University down in Alabama, when all of this was going on, Booker T. Washington was horrified. And he sent an open letter to Benjamin Tillman in the New York World, where he made a very devastatingly accurate prophecy as to what would happen to the state of South Carolina if he went ahead with this. Among other things, he said this: "You, honored sir, are a student of history. Has there ever been a race that has been helped by ignorance? Has there ever been a race that has been harmed by Christian intelligence? It is argued by some that the Negro school should be practically closed because he cannot bear his portion of the taxes. Can an ignorant man produce valuable taxable property faster than an intelligent man? Will capital and immigration be attracted to a state in which 3 out of 4 are ignorant and where poverty and crime are abound?" He goes on to conclude by saying that, "Sir, do not misunderstand me. I am not so selfish as to make this appeal to you in the interest of my race alone. For thank God, a white man is near to my heart as a black man. But whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall reap." And the fact that South Carolina had basically went to war on more than half of its population during this period, that is what kept the state in backwardness and illiteracy over the years. And today we're often wondering, well, how can we get the education in South Carolina better? And I say to that, you can't find the cure until you know the cause, and this was the cause.
And I don't think people realize that we are still operating under that 1895 Constitution.
That's true.
It's just but amended over the years, or the federal government has passed laws that negate some of that Constitution. But I am a firm believer that if the root of the tree is poison, the fruit of the tree will always be poison. And as long as we're operating under that 1895 Constitution, we're not going to see huge improvement. I believe in that Constitution with education. It actually says that the state only needs a minimally adequate education. They literally put it in the Constitution. And they didn't say just for black folks. The target may have been black folks, but that impacts everybody.
They had a 3-tier system going on, because see, the thing about it is, with segregation, you're taking this money and you wasting it on making everything separate, when you could have had just one school system that was good for everybody. But then again, they did not want to mess up this large supply of cheap labor in the state. So you had white cheap labor as well as black cheap labor too. Now, getting back to the Constitution. Now, it is correct that when you say that the federal government, and the Supreme Court and all of that has invalidated some of that, because there's a section in the book that talks about how they made the law against interracial marriages in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And they declared that a black person was, get this, 1/16 of Negro ancestry. Right, if you could actually prove something like that.
So that harkens back to the one drop principle.
Right, but get this. Robert Smalls got up, and it was Article 34, and Robert Smalls in the book, it talks about how he got up and said, well, all right, if you want to make it illegal for white people and black people to marry, okay, fine and good. But he said, I also challenge you to make it illegal for white men to have black concubines. And that threw the South Carolina Senate into a tizzy over that.
I just bet it did.
It did. And Ben Tillman nearly had a heart attack with that because, incidentally, Ben Tillman's campaign manager and lawyer was a fellow by the name of Will Thurman, father of Strom Thurmond, who was the father of my dad's classmate at South Carolina State University in the 1940s, Essie Mae Washington. Hello. So they passed the law against interracial marriages without that little caveat in there, obviously. But it wasn't until now, of course, the Loving versus Virginia in 1967 in the Supreme Court made that null and void. But get this, the South Carolina did not get that taken out of our Constitution until 1998. And when it did that, it only passed with 62% of the popular vote and 38% against in 1998. And when both you and I were fully grown adults. That tells you something.
It tells you a lot. And as I said at the beginning of the show, about things changing, the more they change, the more they stay the same. And I wonder if we did a poll in 2022 right now, what that percentage would be now that people have been freed to express themselves. They're very comfortable in expressing their hate and racism.
Well, I would venture to say that it would be, I do think that it would be less than 38% now, because one of the strangest things I've found, the couple of occasions where for observational purposes I've gone, I went to this rally, President Trump wasn't there, but these were these people who were supporting him, right? I went to check it out just out of curiosity. And one thing you find among a lot of hardcore conservatives these days, you do find a lot of quote unquote, and I say that very deliberately, quote unquote, mixed marriages, because after all, you have human beings marrying human beings, right? But you do tend to see quite a bit of that in those type of circles these days. And I'm not just talking about Ginny and Clarence Thomas either. You see quite a bit.
When I lived in the upstate and I lived in Oconee County, which Oconee and Pickens counties are the two whitest counties in the entire state of South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And I lived there about 3 or 4 years. And I was astounded, I guess, by the number of mixed race children. Yeah. And I hate saying mixed race because we're not.
I know, that's why I said
we're not. And I actually have the problem with the terms biracial, multiracial.
And I understand that.
So I think I take your point, but I think as you and I talked before we came on the show, it's nuanced. Because I think when you say human being to human being, I think that some of them, they see that family member and it's a personal thing for them. It's very individualistic. It's my circumstance, but they can't translate that to society, to a systematic thing. And that's where we have the breakdown in equality and equity. They see, no, my family member is okay. And I've seen it. I've seen it in action. They don't see it as a society thing. They don't think in terms that, there's a possibility that Loving may be struck down under this current Supreme Court because it's not going to impact their family. So it's very individualistic for them, and they don't see it in a societal type of makeup. And and I'll tell you just quickly, I know they're digressing just a little bit, but it does play, what happened in 1895 plays into the root of what's happening now. I don't like the terms mixed race or biracial, multiracial, because I think in particular biracial, multiracial were terms that have been co-opted by the white population because they want the exotic of being black, but not the burden of being black. So they don't want their kids to be black, where clearly by the tone of my skin on both sides of my family, it's been miscegenation. The
Really?
mixing
Wow.
of the races. So
I would have never guessed.
And it gets into that in your book because what you just discussion we're having, Black women were raped. We were concubines. They got upset about what Robert Small says about, where we're going to ban.
Expose that hypocrisy.
Yeah, the hypocrisy of it. And it's nothing new, but all of a sudden it's important to know biracial, multiracial, where there were the mulattoes, the quadrons, the octorons, there were classifications. I remember learning, there are like 16 different degrees. That's how they broke it down, literally by generation, that, you had two white grandparents, you were this, and, but your rest were black. I mean, that's how the racial caste system is so destructive in America. And you said something about wasting energy and funds and segregation in schools. Think of the energy it took into someone coming up with these racial caste systems. When you're in an ideal utopian world, we're all human. And that's actually the reality. It's not even we're all human.
Well, the concept of race didn't even exist until 500 years ago to begin with.
Exactly. Yeah. But the thought that took and it's happening to this day, that people literally are. My grandchild is okay. My grandchild will not be harmed. But you don't see the harm as a society, that the systematic. That's why when people say systemic racism, systemic bias, etc., that's what they're talking about. That's the harm that's being done. And it was codified in the 1895 Constitution of South Carolina.
Right. Very much so.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead. I'm sorry. We digress, but it really is. As you're talking and I'm listening to you, how much that racial hatred and bias makes us all kind of crazy.
Well, it did help. It ruined the progress of South Carolina and many other states. And I would go so far as to say the United States as a whole, because, because you have to remember that there was discrimination and lynchings and all that in the North too, something people like to ignore and forget. But at the same time, though, I don't put this in the category of stories of defeat and despair, because you see, I've always had an issue with histories that made it seem like we just sat back and said, woe is me, when all these things happened to us. And one of the things that I try to get across in stories like this is that these people did not sit back like bumps on a log when things like this happened. They got up and they did something. And that's the beauty of this story, is that it shows that we did not have to wait until a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X and all that. We had their prototypes right here in South Carolina during this time period. As a matter of fact, I just mentioned Malcolm X, right? There was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner of the AME Church, who was taking Black people back to Africa in 1878, before Marcus Garvey was born. And he said to all that was happening at this time, is 1897, let every Negro in this country with a spark of manhood in him supply his house with 1, 2, or 3 guns, with a 7 or 16 shooter, and we advise him to keep him loaded and ready for immediate use. And when his domicile is invaded by bloody lynchers, or any mob by day or by night, Sabbath or weekday, turn you loose your missiles of death and blow your fiendish invaders into 1,000 giblets. So you see, there was resistance like that even back then. And as a matter of fact, Bishop William Chappell, the great grandfather of comedian Dave Chappelle, he was advocating back to Africa during that time period also. And one of the interesting things about the book is that after these men were defeated in the South Carolina legislature by this, the people of Columbia threw a dinner and banquet for them. And Robert Smalls, stayed in politics as long as he could. And there's an interesting story about him where there was a group of lynchers, a lynch mob in Beaufort, and he went to the mayor of Mayor Beaufort and said, "I'd make a deal with you. You stop that lynch mob and me and my men won't burn down your houses."
I love it. I love it.
And
because he was, yeah.
Exactly. And even Robert Anderson made this wonderful speech about the blood of the martyrs during that convention in 1895 and so forth. But now, the sad thing about how that ended is that I went to Beaufort shortly before I spoke to you about all this a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Lawrence Rowland down there at University of South Carolina, Beaufort, told me that James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, the two of the Black Beaufortonians, they literally dropped out of history. There's no record of what happened to them after the convention. Robert Anderson, we know I saw on an internet website that he died in 1901, but not much of him is pretty much said after that. There's a little blurb about him in the Georgetown history book and another in the book South Carolina Negroes 1877 to 1901. But a couple of interesting things happened. William Whipper died in an unmarked grave in Beaufort in 1907. But something interesting happened with Thomas Miller, though. You see, the last Black representative from Reconstruction was a man named George Henry White out of North Carolina, right? Out of Wilmington, North Carolina. And before he left the Senate in left Congress in 1901. He said that Phoenix, we may be gone for now, but Phoenix like we will one day rise again. And 10 years after he died in 1918, you had the first Black representative elected since Reconstruction. That was Oscar DePriest out of Chicago. Well, get this. Negro History Week, February of 1931, Oscar DePriest was in Congress, and he invited two colleagues of his to come before Congress, and one of them was Thomas Miller. Wow. Along with a Black representative from Mississippi named John Lynch. And he told the Congress, listen, these were the Black men who were here before me. And the crowd applauded him, and Thomas Miller lived to see that before he died in 1938.
It's kind of sad how they've been lost to history. I mean, it is sad. My aunt, I was telling, she remembers Robert Anderson Jr., the son, but I never, I didn't know all this. And you and I had that discussion because Robert Anderson is a family member of mine. I went to her. That was something I never heard about in my lifetime until you decided to write this book. And I went to her and she said, well, I knew his son. And I'm thinking, wouldn't you think that was something that you kind of would tell, like family and stuff? But I think some stuff is also painful because even in my aunt's life, she was the first African-American to integrate the teachers in Georgetown County School District. Mm-hmm. And the KKK burnt a cross in her yard. Mm-hmm. And she never talked about it.
Of course not.
Until later years.
Of course not.
It was so painful. So I'm sometimes look back and thinking that our ancestors didn't talk about a lot of painful stuff.
I don't.
And it's lost the time, But she talks about it more now because I've kind of some things I've kind of pushed, She's more open. She's been receiving recognition for her integration, and that story comes up. But now, I mean, she's 89, so it's later years. But depending on when someone passed, did they, you know, I understand not. I'm not beating them up over it at all. I'm just trying to, I guess, explain how I've concluded it was so painful for them to discuss it. But the other side of that is that we lose the information because it isn't captured in mainstream history books, because honestly the mythology of the South, the whitewashing of history and such greatness has been lost to us because it wasn't shared and written down in books. And that's why your book is so important. That's why your book is so important, because it captures these stories of heroes. Going back to what you were saying, and this is how I want to end it because we got about 7 minutes. I want to end with what do you want us to get out of this book?
Well, a number of things. Number one, as I said earlier, it's not that we just sat back and did nothing when these things happened. Black people and white sympathizers exist, even back then, there was resistance to these things. And we need to know that, because you have so much bad history out there right now. There are these characters on YouTube that have this nonsense about us not being from Africa, being here before the Native Americans, and that Harriet Tubman was a fictional character. All this just garbage. And if I wasn't such a gentleman, I would use the words that I really think about things like that. But I have to set a good example for the young people, so I won't say that. But what I will say about this is that, yes, there is lost history out there for several reasons. Number one, I found much of this story from the old issues of the Charleston News and Courier and the Columbia State newspaper, right? And those daily mainstream papers are intact in their libraries going back to the 1800s in both cases, okay? The Columbia State started in 1891. The Charleston News and Courier started in 1803. So we can go back through all of that stuff. Now, in Charleston, we had a black newspaper called the Charleston Messenger that existed from 1894 to 1946. Only 5 issues still exist. The black newspaper in Spartanburg, my birthplace, the Hub City Observer, only 3 issues exist. The Charleston Chronicle just shut down after 50 years, black newspaper. And they used to have some microfilms at the library, but right now, microfilms are not being used. So that's another bunch of lost history. You see, the fact is, so many of our best stories are forever lost to the graveyards. And it is up to the people like myself who know how to dig deep for these things to go and get this stuff and bring it back and bring it before the people. Why? Because in China, when they had the Warring States period and the country was just going straight to hell through warlords and people stabbing each other and all of that, Confucius read the teachings of the ancient Chinese masters and went throughout China trying to influence the warlords and kings of China to follow those wise teachings that were left behind. They ignored him, but the young people of his day were listening. And even though he died thinking he was a failure, the young people remembered his teachings and put them together in the Analects of Confucius, and that became required reading in China up until the Communist Revolution some 70 years ago. So they use that as a guide to this day. When you go to church, you hear the teachings of the Hebrew prophets of the Bible, who have long since been dead. But they use that to teach us today because of the good lessons that they have for us now. So I say all that to say that's why I do this, because right now we have a lot of young people who want to do the right thing. But unfortunately, the direction and leadership is not always there, even for a lot of elders. That people just don't really know what to do. Therefore, I put this stuff out there so that they can say, okay, look, here is some instructions left behind for some really great people. What you have to do is take this stuff, adapt it to modern usage, and combine it with their skills at technology and networking, and the synthesis of these things will give us the blueprint of what we need for a better today and a better tomorrow.
That is well said. And
Thank you.
well said, and exactly what we needed to hear, because I wanted to bring you on. One, because you're so fascinating. It's the history you need to know. But I really think people really understand that we were victimized, but we were not victims. We really did. I just on TikTok had a back and forth with someone who was saying the slaves didn't build anything. They didn't do this. They literally said that they took care of the veggie gardens. So I replied back, and then of course there was some pushback, and someone said, "Oh, they didn't build anything." Literally, our finger marks of our ancestors are in the brickwork. We built this. We built these buildings and everything. But even more importantly, we built a whole new culture, the Gullah Geechee culture. That takes intellect, that takes strength. And I think people really need to understand when they hear about the Robert Smalls and the Robert Andersons and the Thomas Millers, that this wasn't random, that their parents and grandparents had intellect and put the seeds in place for them to be the great men that they were. And then history put them in place to push back against the Tillmans. Were they successful? No. But
Not initially.
Not initially, but the long
They
term.
led the blueprint to succeed against the late.
Exactly.
They planted the seeds.
And what you just said, Confucius traveled in China. Our wise elders are always planting the seeds, planting the fruit, and we need to nurture them and go back. And yes, some of it is corrupted, you have to be discerning, but these are the conversations we have to have. These are the books we have to read, because it goes back to intellect. If you can read, if you can write, you can do anything. And Frederick Douglass, our ancestors understood that. They understood that. And that's half the battle. That's why they attacked public school education. That's why they put in the 1895 Constitution minimally adequate, because they knew if we give these people, that's why in the Black Codes during slavery, they banned teaching enslaved persons how to read and write, and made it illegal to learn how to read and write, because they knew that was the strength. That then we could tell the stories, then we could do the trainings, then we could nurture the children, the next generations, to do better and be in the fight, and be like a Robert Smalls and push back and say, well, I'll bring my men and burn down your houses.
And let me add this also, folks.
Go ahead.
If you can read Facebook, you can certainly read a real book. So try it sometime, all right?
That's right. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Nia, thank you for your comments. You are correct. We are still dealing with trauma. We are still dealing with historical trauma and the trauma of our ancestors. And but in reading and learning and going to therapy, folks, we we can heal ourselves too. We can go on a healing path, a healing journey.
Let me say this about
Go
that
ahead.
briefly, is that, when I was telling you before we started this about my trip to Africa in May. And one of the things that impressed me so much was that how, whereas we are in America are relatively rich in income, many of us are poor in spirit, in part because of that historical trauma. But in West Africa, I saw people who were poor in income, but yet rich in spirit. And one of the things that I told them when I get back, not only am I going to tell the truth about Africa, but I'm also going to tell about what I saw, the pride and dignity that I saw with the poorest Africans in the jungles and the huts and all of that, had the same amount of dignity as the scholars and leaders that I met over there, because they knew what it was to have the experience of being able to have the opportunity to one day run their own countries and all of that. If we were to bring that spirit over here, there'd be nothing that could stop us. And that's for all of humanity too.
I agree with you on that, Damon. I think that's a wonderful way to end the show. I want you to come back when you're ready to talk about the book so we can get into it even more. I think this was a wonderful discussion, but there's so much more in that book for us to understand. So that the door is open for your return anytime you're ready to come.
Oh, wait, I'll be in Georgetown. August the 20th, Rice Museum, 2:30 in the afternoon, Saturday.
And if we want to buy the book, where do we go?
To the right, okay, in Georgetown, you can get it at the Rice Museum. They're available at the various Barnes and Noble stores. In Charleston, you can get them at Buxton Books at 160 King Street. And if you can't find them at your Barnes and Noble store, you can ask them to order it for you because they have it in their system.
And you will be in Georgetown Saturday, August 20th, 2:30
right.
p.m. at the Rice Museum. So if you want a signed book, and if you want to, are you going to do a book reading, questions?
I'm going to lecture on the book, and I'm going to have a meet and greet so I can meet you and meet all of you out there and sign your books and take pictures with you and all that other good stuff. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Damon. I appreciate it. So y'all, August 20th in Georgetown at the Rice Museum. That's Saturday, August 20th at 2:30. And if you can't make it, but we hope you do, go to Barnes and Noble, and books should be there. And if it's not, they'll order it for you. Damon, thank you very much for joining me.
And one more thing, my YouTube channel is The American Storyteller, where you can learn more about things like this. Okay.
You can't tell me that. YouTube channel, go like and subscribe. American Storyteller.
The American Storyteller, yes.
The American Storyteller on YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe. And while you're there, go to Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce page and like and subscribe, because A Gathering Place is live on YouTube, it's live on Twitter, and it's live on Facebook every Sunday and Wednesday at 4:00 p.m. But make sure you go to The American Storyteller, and you can catch Damon on there also. Did we cover everything?
We did.
Very good. All right, Damon, thank you for coming and everything. I always enjoy you in our conversations, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Will do.
All right. Everyone, what a wonderful conversation with Damon Fordham. Always enjoy having him join us on A Gathering Place, which happens every Sunday and Wednesday at 4:00. And this Wednesday, I want to let you know that we're going to have Brenda Dozier Perkins with the Browns Ferry Community Outreach, because we love to focus on our Gullah Geechee communities and find out about the communities and their history and what made this community come about, because a lot of them came out during emancipation and Reconstruction. And we want to find out what's going on in those communities today. So Brenda Dozier Perkins is going to join us this coming Wednesday, August 3rd at 4:00 to talk about the Browns Ferry Community Outreach. They got a lot going on out in Browns Ferry. And then next Saturday, we have a pop-up shop. The Bucksport Entrepreneur Class graduation is going to be a pop-up shop Saturday, August 6th, 9 a.m. to 12 noon at Donnie's Grill, 915 Bucksport Road. Now, this pop-up shop is our entrepreneurship class sponsored by the Gullah Geechee Chamber Foundation and the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce. Our next class is opening on September 1st, 2022. Registration opens tomorrow. You can go to our Eventbrite page and get registered. Gullah Geechee University, our 12-week entrepreneur culturally embedded course. It's about the culture. We'll make sure you have a lean business plan, 5 additional hours with a business coach, appropriate addition to the Gullah Geechee Seafood Trail database, and membership in the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce at a discount rate of $200. All right. And if you live in Bucksport, you know what you can do. Give me a call. Thank you for the generous donation of the Horry County government. We are allowing folks in Bucksport can attend for free, only if you live in Bucksport. And I'll let you know how to do that. Just give me a call. And then Saturday, October 15th, save the date for the Gullah Geechee Environmental and Energy Conference coming in Georgetown, South Carolina, in person at the Howard Center, or you can register virtually. Registration will be opening up at the end of August. So, folks, we got a lot going on. I'll be in Beaufort this week. Looking forward to seeing everybody in Beaufort. We're going to do a Gullah Geechee Seafood Trail focus group and the Gullah Geechee Seafood kickoff on Thursday, August 4th. Hope to see our folks there, and looking forward to hang out in Beaufort for a few days. And of course, this week is Gullah Geechee Nation Appreciation Week, brought to us by the Gullah Geechee Nation and Queen Quet and her network of folks, and we're looking forward to enjoying Gullah Geechee Appreciation Week, Gullah Geechee Family Day. So y'all going down to Beaufort this week and have a good old time and learn more about our community. And once again, this Wednesday at 4 o'clock, we're talking with Brenda Dozier Perkins with the Browns Ferry Community Outreach. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Damon Fordham, for joining us. As always, we enjoyed. And y'all, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a good night.